I knew what we were doing was wrong, but we thought we could get away with it.
On a Tuesday afternoon in August 1998, an LAPD supervisor opened a routine audit of the Rampart Division's evidence storage room. What he found should not have been there. 6 pounds of cocaine logged into evidence by Officer Rafael Perez 18 months earlier in connection with a drug arrest, signed in, signed out, and then signed back in again, poorly. The paperwork didn't match, the weight was wrong, and when investigators pulled the security footage, what they saw made it impossible to explain away. Rafael Perez had walked into that evidence room and helped himself. He was arrested, he was charged, and he was given a choice that men in his position are always given. Face the full weight of what you've done alone, or start talking. Rafael Perez started talking. And what came out of his mouth over the following months would force the LAPD to overturn over 100 criminal convictions, pay out more than $125 million in civil settlements, and confront the fact that for years one of its own divisions had been operating as something closer to a criminal gang than a police unit. The Rampart scandal is the story of what happens when the people given power to enforce the law decide the law doesn't apply to them. It ran for years. It destroyed lives. It was hidden in St. Plaint, inside one of America's most scrutinized police departments. My name is Investigator Sam. This is what actually happened inside the LAPD's Rampart Division crash unit, and why the only person who ever told the full truth only did it to save himself. To understand Rampart, you have to understand Los Angeles in the early 1990s. The city was in the middle of a gang crisis that had no clean solution. The Bloods, the Crips, MS-13, 18th Street, these weren't just street gangs, they were territorial organizations with tens of thousands of members across the city. Homicide rates were climbing. Communities in South and Central LA were living inside a war that the rest of the city preferred not to look at directly. The LAPD's response was CRASH, the Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums Unit, anti-gang specialists, officers hand-picked for toughness, aggression, and results. They operated with considerable independence inside their divisions. The philosophy was simple. You knew who the gang members were, you knew what they were doing, and your job was to get them off the street by whatever means necessary. That phrase, whatever means necessary, is where everything went wrong. The Rampart Division crash unit covered one of the most densely gang-affected areas in the city. The officers who worked there developed their own culture, their own rules, their own understanding of what policing meant. And over time, with minimal oversight and enormous street authority, that culture curdled into something the LAPD would spend years trying to explain away. What Rafael Perez described when he started cooperating with investigators was not a few officers making bad decisions under pressure. It was a system. Officers in the Rampart crash unit were routinely planting drugs and weapons on suspects they wanted to arrest. People with no contraband on them would be stopped, searched, and then, after the officer's hand went into a pocket or behind a waistband, suddenly found to be in possession of narcotics or a firearm. The arrest would be made, the paperwork would be filed, the suspect would go to prison, the officer would move on to the next one. Gang members were beaten in custody and then charged with assaulting an officer. Witnesses were threatened or ignored. Informants were protected regardless of what crimes they committed. Evidence was fabricated, lost, or altered as the situation required. And when officers shot people, which happened, the accounts they gave afterward were constructed to justify what had occurred, not to describe it. Perez described one incident that became the defining image of the entire scandal. In 1996, crash officers stopped a young man named Javier Ovando, a gang associate with no weapon on him. Officer Perez and his partner shot Ovando, leaving him paralyzed from the chest down and in a vegetative state. Then they planted a weapon near his body, filed a report claiming he had threatened them first, and watched as the unconscious, paralyzed man was convicted of assault in a trial he could not participate in. He was sentenced to 23 years in prison. He served 2.5 years in prison, in a wheelchair, unable to speak, before Perez confessed. But here's where it gets worse, because Javier Ovando wasn't an exception. He was the example Perez chose to lead with, because there were others. Over the course of his cooperation agreement, Rafael Perez gave investigators more than 4,000 pages of testimony. He named officers. He named incidents. He described a culture inside Rampart CRS where misconduct wasn't hidden from colleagues. It was shared, celebrated, and protected. Officers who crossed the line covered for each other as a matter of professional loyalty. Supervisors who might have asked questions either didn't look closely enough or chose not to see what was in front of them. Investigators began pulling case files. What they found aligned with what Perez was telling them in ways that were impossible to dismiss. Conviction after conviction began to unravel. People who had been in prison for years, some for nearly a decade, had been put there on evidence that had been manufactured or testimony that had been fabricated. The LAPD's Internal Affairs Division opened over 100 separate investigations into Rampart officers. 70 officers were ultimately investigated. 12 were fired. 7 were criminally charged. The city of Los Angeles entered into a consent decree with the U.S. Department of Justice, a formal federal oversight arrangement that placed the LAPD under external monitoring for the first time in its history. It would remain in place for a decade, and the civil settlements began. More than 140 civil claims were filed by people who had been wrongfully convicted or brutalized by Rampart officers. The city paid out more than $125 million. And the worst part? Of the 70 officers investigated, the men Perez named, the men whose cases unraveled in front of a federal investigation, most kept their jobs. Some were promoted. Rafael Perez pleaded guilty to stealing cocaine from an evidence locker. He received a 5-year sentence. With credit for his cooperation, he served less than 3 years. The officers he named did not fare much worse. The criminal cases against Rampart officers were largely unsuccessful. Prosecutors struggled to build cases that didn't rely almost entirely on the testimony of a convicted evidence thief, a man who had his own reasons to cooperate and his own version of events that could not always be independently verified. One officer, Brian Hewitt, was convicted of brutality. The conviction was later overturned. David Mack, one of the most heavily implicated officers, was convicted, not for anything related to Rampart, but for a separate bank robbery. He served time for that. The Rampart charges against him never resulted in a conviction. For the families of the people who had been framed, imprisoned, and brutalized by Rampart officers, the outcome was difficult to reconcile. The system had acknowledged what happened. It had paid settlements. It had commissioned reports. And then it had returned most of the people responsible to their lives with minimal consequence. Javier Ovando received a $15 million settlement from the city of Los Angeles. He remained paralyzed.
He died in 2003 at 27 years old. But here's what the official reports didn't answer. If this was happening inside Rampart, inside one division of one city's police department, the question investigators never fully asked is where else?
The consent decree between the LAPD and the Department of Justice brought real structural changes. New oversight mechanisms, new use of force reporting requirements, new systems for tracking complaints against officers. The department was monitored, measured, and held to external standards it had previously been able to define for itself. By most assessments, the LAPD that emerged from the Rampart scandal was a more accountable institution than the one that preceded it. Community policing programs expanded, transparency improved. The CRAS unit itself was formally disbanded in 2000. But the question that sat underneath all of it, the question that the official investigation circled without fully answering, was about culture, not structure. The officers of Rampart Crash didn't build their system in secret. They built it in a division with supervisors and captains and a chain of command that extended all the way to the top of one of America's largest police departments. The paperwork passed through desks. The arrests were reviewed. The convictions stood for years. At what point did someone know and decide that what they knew was easier to live with than what it would cost to act on it? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think justice should have looked like here. If stories like this matter to you, the ones the official record doesn't fully tell, subscribe. I cover one every week. And if you know someone who needs to see this, send it to them.